You just have to be really clear about who you are and the values, and you have to understand what those things are. For me, transparency, integrity, leader development. But you also have to remind yourself that your private equity sponsor put a lot of their money, a lot of their LP's money, a lot of lender money into this business. And you can't forget that your primary job is to return shareholder value. I think it's just reducing the noise that goes on between the ears and simplifying it down to your personal values and reminding yourself of your primary role.
Welcome to the X Factor, where we visit with proven private equity leaders to unpack a compelling area of value creation to help our listeners gain an edge as they grind toward a liquidity event of their own. X Factor is presented by Private Equity CXO, the world's largest digital community of PE-backed executives. You can find a link to PECXO in the description to start your free membership and unlock exclusive content. I'm your host, Rob Huxtable, a partner at Falcon, a retained executive search firm exclusively recruiting C-level leaders for private equity-owned portfolio companies. Excited today to be joined by friend and private equity-backed CEO Bill Wasilius to talk all things accelerating success in the CEO role, or C-suite for that matter. And he's got incredible points of view from not only having been a successful CEO who got to a great liquidity event, but since he put himself on that radar in the last 12 months, he's advised more than a dozen private equity firms on deal sourcing that they're evaluating. So he's been quite the popular person here lately, and as a result has great insight, having both been in the seat as well as this advisor role, to kind of marry up a perspective that we hope can help everybody here be a little bit better at their jobs in the audience. So with that said, Bill, welcome. Happy to have you.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate it. I hope the look here is not a prerequisite for who you have on your show, because we kind of look similar here.
Yeah, well, in the future, hair will evolve away from necessity. So that's the way I try to think about it.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, great. So let's just jump in. Tell us a little bit, sort of a 2 to 3 minute summary of your background and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You set a pretty high bar there. I've been in the tech services, called it tech-enabled services industry now for 25 years. Prior to that, spent 8 years on active duty in the U.S. Air Force after graduating from the Air Force Academy in the late 90s. So I'm an accidental IT guy. When I first got into this industry 25 years ago, I thought a router took the edge off of a piece of wood, which is true, but not the kind that we deal with in our industry. But in that 25-year career leading up to the most recent run that you mentioned as the CEO of Nexus Tech, almost all of that, with the exception of about 2 years of that, have been in private equity portfolio companies. Early in my career, obviously wasn't directly interfacing with our sponsors, but in the latter part of my career, both at Nexus Tech and the role right before that at Optiv Security, had quite a bit of interaction with our private equity sponsors, Blackstone, KKR, and most recently at Nexus Tech, Abry Partners. So I have a little bit of insight into this private equity world. I was a first-time CEO when I got to Nexus Tech in 2019. And with that comes a lot of figuring stuff out. I remember, I'll tell a quick story here. When I left Optiv Security in 2019 to take the CEO role at Nexus Tech, I sat down with my CEO at Optiv and I said, okay, his name's Dan Burns, good friend of mine. I said, tell me what I need to know, right? I'm going to go be a first-time CEO. Tell me what I need to know. And about a year later, I sat down for dinner with him. I said, man, you lied to me. Everything you told me to be prepared for didn't happen. And all this other stuff happened, including pandemics and turnaround situation, those sorts of things that I was unprepared for. So I had a trial by fire for sure.
Yeah, good deal. And then I know that also helped inspire you to launch a bit of a coaching practice on the side. Tell us a little bit about that.
It did, yeah. I started a leadership development business called Latitude 40 Leadership earlier this year after I stepped down from Nexus Tech. And I'll tell you, the genesis behind that has been an idea in my head for many, many years before I was a CEO. And I always held people in high regard that were mentors to me that kind of helped me along the way, told me the things that I wouldn't have otherwise gotten to know. And so when I ended up in the CEO seat at Nexus Tech, one of the parts of the job as a CEO, in my opinion, there's kind of three main responsibilities. One is you're responsible for managing the culture in your business. Two, you're mitigating risk, and three, you're returning shareholder value. But part of that, maintaining the culture, was a part of the job that I really, really like, is mentoring future leaders, right? The people that at some point in their career, they're going to have a C in their title, and teaching all the things that they don't teach in traditional leadership programs. Those traditional leadership programs are, how to manage people and how to performance manage and all of that sort of stuff. They don't teach you the things that you really need to know to be an executive. And so that was really the genesis behind the business, was to help, kind of pay it forward.
So let's go back in time. You landed your first PE-backed CEO gig, and what kind of was what you expected, and then what surprises were all too real as you stepped into that first-time CEO role?
It's probably worth mentioning, I got the call to be a first-time CEO from a private equity sponsor that I knew. I had done a little bit of work back in the late 2000s for Abry Partners as an operating advisor on another asset that they owned 15 years ago that looked an awful lot like Nexus Tech. So when they bought that business in 2018 and decided to make a leadership change, I got the phone call primarily for two reasons, I think. One, I was a known quantity. I knew them, they knew me. It was in my industry that I had spent a lot of time in, and I was in Denver, Colorado, which is where that business was headquartered. So there was a lot of things going for me there, but there was a level of familiarity with the Abry Partner folks, kind of coming into that role. I think the biggest thing that was a surprise was the sense of urgency around the turnaround situation that I stepped into. Abry Partners had bought Nexus Tech in, call it, early 2018, about 18 months before I started. And then in that 18-month period, had bought 6 other businesses. It was a roll-up strategy, as is pretty common in my industry. And I think there was a fair bit of discovery on both parts, mine and Abry Partners side, about what we were dealing with. There was a sense of urgency that was needed financially as well as operationally to turn that business around. I think the punchline there is it was much more of a turnaround than it was a growth story in the early days, right? In the first couple of years.
Yeah, we see that pretty regularly, where clearly private equity is engaged and hands-on, and they know their businesses, but they don't know them quite as well as a hands-on CEO on the ground, living it 18 hours a day out of the gate. So as an aside, how did you take them through that journey of, hey folks, this is what we really have here? It may not be quite as optimistic as you all were hoping.
One, I didn't create those problems, right? I inherited them. And also I had a level of familiarity with the folks on the deal team that I was interacting with. So it was pretty easy for me in the first 90 days to sit down with them and have those hard conversations that sounded an awful lot like, I'm not sure what you thought you bought, but this is what you have. And it was the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we were just realists about it. And that's one of the things I really liked about that relationship that I have, and I still have to this day with Abry, is they had some expertise in the sector. It wasn't like maybe some other private equity stories that you hear where, they're a capital partner, but they don't really add a whole lot of value. In this case, Abry had owned a number of other assets that were in this industry. And so it was more of a collaborative kind of relationship with them throughout that stay. I could call them and say, hey, here's what I'm seeing. I'm not really sure what it means or what's been done in the past, but here's what I'm thinking. And I would get creative, valuable input from them. So we were, quote unquote, in the trenches together. I would summarize it by saying that onboarding for me was much easier, it was made much easier for me because of those three reasons. Now, the job at hand was hard, but the interaction with my sponsor was easy just because we spoke the same language, we were familiar with each other, and there was no game playing or no posturing.
The ironic piece of that is, of course, the history you all had together helped support that kind of an environment. But I think that's what just about every private equity sponsor wants with their CEO is a trust-based, candid, matter-of-fact conversation backed by high velocity response to address all challenges and opportunities. So I would wish for every C-suite executive out there who's newly minted with a private equity firm to almost behave as if you've got that level of familiarity and trust, because the resulting behaviors will only help foster a more productive relationship.
My wife is also an executive at a private equity portfolio company, and I've seen it throughout my career. We almost create this image of a private equity sponsor as the boogeyman, right? There's a reputation, that exists in the space, and if you believe that and you forget that they're after the same thing that we're after, right? And they need somebody to tell them how it is, not tell them what they want to hear. If you remember those things and you're not afraid to be honest and transparent with them, the relationship goes a lot better. People tend to overthink the role of the private equity sponsor and what they want to hear and how they want to hear it. And they spend ridiculous amounts of time on sort of the superficial things and not on substance and content. I think, if you just keep that in mind when you step into a role like that, it makes it easier.
Any other tactics or ideas that come to mind on how to manage the inevitable, the nature of the conversations that unfold between management and sponsors when the balance sheet's competing with the income statement,
Yeah.
and how you can help navigate some of those challenges? We've talked about transparency. We've talked about the real-time nature of your communication. Anything else come to mind that
Yeah.
made it easier for you?
In this case, it aligns with kind of who I am as a human being. I'm data driven as a human. You talk to my wife, she'd tell you I have a spreadsheet for pretty much everything, right? Which that generally aligns with how private equity sponsors look at these businesses. So if you're not data driven, you need to learn how to be. The tough part about this is in many cases, especially in an M&A roll-up platform like we were at Nexus Tech, oftentimes you're dealing with imperfect data. The data that you need in order to make the decisions that you need to make isn't perfect. It's not integrated. You don't have a single reporting platform. You also have to develop, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good kind of mentality. It's like, I've got data, I've got directional intelligence on the business, and it may not be perfect, but it's the best I've got. And you need to be comfortable with that scenario.
And how do you find private equity responds to sort of what could be considered bad news if the information is delivered on time and with insight?
Well, they never like bad news, right? That part is, I think, a universal truth. Depending on your relationship with your sponsor, you can deliver bad news and it's not, the kiss of death. But having your own set of values, and one of mine is I'm going to be honest. I'm going to tell you the truth, whether you like the answer or not. And I manage my life that way. So it wasn't anything different. I didn't have to put on a mask as a CEO, as a first-time CEO, because I just wasn't going to do that. I'd rather look myself in the mirror after delivering some bad news and go, that was the right thing to do, even if they didn't like the results. Now, what I also learned is that you have a window, and this is, if I'm reflective of how I onboarded into that role 5 years ago, you have a window of opportunity when you first step in, especially in the scenario where I did, right? It was the replacement situation. You have a window where you can assess the business and really be brutally honest about what it is, right? Because you didn't create those issues. My recommendation is take your time if you can, right? In certain situations, maybe you have to jump in and make some snap decisions, but take your time, make sure that you have a good picture of what you've got. It's one of the flaws of being old and not having a lot of hair is we got that way from experience. And sometimes our experience colors our perception of our current situation. You may jump to it may be natural to jump to a conclusion about what's wrong with the business or what needs to be done. Patience and making sure that you're triangulating in on the truth, right? You're getting all kinds of inputs. You've got data coming out of your systems that may or may not be accurate. You've got feedback from your existing team, which may or may not be reflective of reality. And you have to triangulate in on the truth. And I would just say, you have a window where the sponsor expects that, right? If you onboard into a role and a week later you've got it all figured out, then maybe you didn't spend enough time. That's kind of where I go.
Yeah, I've heard the phrase be patient with outcomes, but impatient with actions. So you
Yeah.
can never stop swinging the axe, but you got to give it time in certain instances to, I suppose, gestate. Did you ever deal with imposter syndrome? I know we all do at some level, but when you become a CEO, I think the expectation is you've got the bravado and the confidence and you're all squared away. But everybody's a human being. And I know for a fact that most of the candidates I've worked with over the years deal with it at some level. But looking back, what was that like as you experienced it? And what would you tell your younger self?
Yeah, it's a great question. I definitely have felt that imposter syndrome at times. I felt like when I stepped into that role, I was ready for it. I thought I could figure it out if there wasn't something, if there was something that I had never dealt with before. And there was plenty of those things in the first, call it 2 to 3 years in the seat. There were a couple of occasions where I went, whoa, I just had never dealt with it before. And there were times where I kind of pinched myself and said, am I really prepared for this? But that's where it goes back to my personal values. I was never going to pretend that I was something other than who I am. I would openly admit to Abry partners, hey, I've never dealt with this before. Can you help me understand your perspective? And here's an example. I had been in prior businesses before that. I had been sort of tangentially involved in M&A, usually at the late end of due diligence. If we were buying a business, evaluating that business, evaluating the people and kind of building the integration plan. But I had never done any of the sourcing, offer, LOI up to, getting a deal signed. I'd never been involved in any of that before. And here I found myself in an M&A roll-up platform. So, the first couple of times that we were on the buy side when I was a CEO, those were muscles that had not been fully developed yet. I remember that imposter feeling, but instead of keeping it inside and pretending as if I know what I'm doing, because I've been there a million times before, I just freely admitted it and said, help me out with these things that, are blind spots for me.
Yeah. Speaking of admitting situations, mistakes are universally considered the better teacher than successes. And you can't be a real CEO or C-level executive if you haven't made more than your share. So how about a pivotal mistake that you made in your first time CEO gig that you were able to respond to, recover from, and what the lesson was?
It goes back to the three most important things the CEO is responsible for: manage the culture, mitigate risk, and return shareholder value. I wasn't fooling myself when I got into the role that Abry Partners wasn't going to sell that business. In fact, by the time I started, they had been in it maybe 3 years, give or take. And so that typical, investment hold period sell cycle is somewhere between 3 to 5 years typically, right? And if all goes well. In my case, and in many cases with people like me, we ran into an environment where none of us had ever experienced before, called a global pandemic. And that happened about 6 months after I started. So not only did I have a bit of a turnaround in my hands, but then I all of a sudden had to rethink how we ran the business and stuff that today, here we are 4 years post pandemic, we all look back and went, oh, well, that wasn't as bad as we thought, right? Working remote, shutting down offices, dealing with customers that maybe were struggling financially, all those sorts of things. There were probably a couple of mistakes that I made in that period. The one that everybody struggles with right now is this sort of, how hard do I push my team to go back to some semblance of a return to the office type of environment. Some larger companies, Google and Meta and some of the others, have publicly kind of been scrutinized for that heavy-handed approach of, we're going to go back to the office. And we didn't do that. We stayed a virtual company basically throughout, not only throughout the pandemic, but all the way up until the time I left. And when we did that, we lost a little bit of crosstalk culture that you gather from being around other people. Looking back on it, I wish I had pushed harder for some semblance of a return to the office kind of model. And I think that's just going to naturally happen over time. I don't think it caused irreparable harm, but I do wonder at times whether, the outcome would have been significantly better if I'd done that.
Yeah, well, you got to look at the film. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to improve. So I think that's a fair, open-ended question that'll never be answered. But it'll help inform what you do going forward. How do you think you're different today as a leader than the day before you started your first CEO gig? What did it teach you?
You're not the expert. And I interact with a lot of other CEOs of managed IT service provider businesses, and there is the owner founder sort of mentality, and a lot of the businesses that private equity firms buy are owner founder led. Those owner founders are often the smartest person in the room, and they're also often the person that knows everything that's going on in the business. And I came into that role knowing I was not the smartest person in the room. The sheer volume of information and decisions that came my way, I had to throw my hands up and go, I cannot be the expert on everything in this business, and I have to rely on key individuals. It's sort of part of why I put such a high emphasis on leadership development, because you have to have a solid foundation of leaders around you that can be the experts in a piece of the business. It's just the sheer volume of what goes on in a national platform, $100 million a year business. You can't be the expert. You can maybe as an owner founder of a smaller business, but usually the platforms that private equity firms are trying to build, you're just not going to be successful if that's your mentality of you want to be involved in every decision and be the final say. It's impossible, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So kind of tying it all together, whether somebody's a first-time CXO or is just struggling finding their sea legs in their current role, what's your advice, I guess, particularly for those first-timers as they head into a tough challenge?
You've probably heard the EQ versus IQ kind of discussion. You just have to be really clear about who you are and the values and your things that drive you as a human being. And those are your base. I was a wrestler, way back in my early days. And you always have to tell yourself, I have to get back to my base, right? In situations that are new, you've never dealt with before, maybe you're second guessing yourself. You just got to get back to your base. You have to understand what those things are. For me, transparency, integrity, leader development, those things that I sort of preach about. But you also have to remind yourself that your private equity sponsor put a lot of their money, a lot of their LP's money, a lot of lender money into this business. And you can't forget that your primary job is to return shareholder value. And sometimes if you lose sight of that, life can get difficult for you. I think it's just simplifying, reducing the noise, that goes on between the ears, and simplifying it down to your personal values, and reminding yourself of your primary role.
Simplified approaches allow for more velocity, which is what everybody wants. And I think, to your point, you work for private equity, but they're also not the big bad wolf. At the same time, you've got to recognize that they have a ton at stake professionally and personally. And finding that balance that says we're in it together and executing accordingly is the real trick, because not every fund is a fit for every leader, and vice versa.
This perception, or it is a myth, right, that the private equity firms are the boogeyman. Not only do they put a lot of money and other people's money and expect a certain return, you could make the argument that maybe some sponsors are a little less rooted in reality in terms of what that opportunity is. The fact is that the vast majority of investments don't return the investment that they expect, right? They don't produce the investment, what was in the investment thesis, but some are home runs, and those make up for the strikeouts. And the better PE firms, have better batting average. But you also have to remind yourself that those folks that work in those private equity firms are smart human beings. Like, they're some of the smartest people I have ever met. And some of them are so smart, they're scary, right? Because they see things in data, they see things that you just can't even fathom. I guess the reason I bring that up is because I don't believe, I've been asked this question, Bill, why would you go do private equity work again? It almost killed you. And it's like, that's true. I was in the seat for 5 years. I feel like I got 10 years of experience as a CEO in the seat. I wouldn't trade it for a thing. They're not the boogeyman. The better private equity firms understand what they know and what they don't know, and they trust the executives that they bring in to lead those businesses. I would just say, I think it's a little unfair for the reputation that the industry as a whole gets. I hope to continue to spend the rest of my working future in private equity, just because I like the speed and velocity that it operates at.
If anybody out there in the audience would like to avail themselves of your coaching services, what's the best way to find you?
Check out the website, latitude40leadership.com. There's a way to contact if you see something that interests you. We kind of divided up our offerings based on where you're at in your career. If you're a first-time leader and you want to know the basics of being a good leader, as opposed to you're a VP or somebody whose next job will be a seat at the table with a C in your title. And then obviously if you're in it, you're in that role now, and it's that's more one-on-one kind of coaching. But the topics that we focus on in there are, they range from how to read an income statement. I'm shocked at how many executives don't know basic financial principles. So we start with that. We start with self-awareness, right? You can't be a good leader until you understand yourself. We get into other topics like, how to lead high-performing teams, and how to do M&A, and how to do integration, and those kinds of topics. And they're not typical things that you would get in a company-sponsored leadership development program. So I know that's a long-winded way of answering your question, but that's what that's all about.
Well, the spectrum of requirements and capabilities in a C-suite role in PE is broad and complex, no doubt. So that stands to reason. Well, reach out to Bill if you all have questions. If not, take some of his counsel to heart to help optimize your performance in your own hold period. And Bill, thank you again for joining us. Let's circle back up in a couple of years and do it again. That'd be fun. Thanks again, Rock. Appreciate it. Be sure to tune in to our next episode. I'm your host, Rob Huxtable, and thank you for listening to The X Factor.